At a lavish charity gala, a billionaire stumbles upon a photo that stops him cold. His ex-wife cradling a baby he never knew existed. The shocking discovery sets him on a quest for answers that will change everything. The ballroom was alive with the buzz of chatter, clinking glasses, and soft classical music played by an elegant quartet in the corner. It was a night meant for celebration, a gathering of the city's elite under the glittering chandelier of one of the most luxurious hotels. Nathaniel Carter, the billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, moved through the crowd with his usual air of confidence. Every conversation he joined, every handshake he gave, was met with admiration and respect. Yet for all the glamour and attention surrounding him, Nathaniel often felt a hollow space within, one that no amount of wealth or prestige seemed able to fill. This gala, hosted in support of underprivileged children, had been added to his schedule as an obligation rather than a passion. Nathaniel's assistant had insisted it would be good for the company's image, especially given recent criticisms about his detachment from social issues. But as the evening wore on, Nathaniel found himself drawn to the exhibits, collections of photos and stories of children who had been helped by the organization. He paused in front of a series of black and white photographs displayed on a decorative board, each capturing moments of joy amidst hardship. A particular photo caught his attention. A woman cradling a baby, her expression a mix of love and weariness. The scene was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. As he leaned closer, studying the delicate curve of the woman's jaw and the shape of her eyes, his breath caught in his throat. It was her. The woman in the photograph was Elise, his ex-wife. Her unmistakable features stared back at him, softened by the monochrome image, but no less vivid in his memory. Nathaniel's gaze shifted to the baby she held. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old, with bright eyes and a delicate smile that tugged at something deep within him. Nathaniel's world tilted on its axis. Elise had disappeared from his life years ago, shortly after their contentious divorce. Their marriage had been a whirlwind of passion and arguments, fueled by his relentless work schedule and her need for emotional connection. They had parted on bitter terms, each blaming the other for the cracks that had formed between them. And yet, here she was, holding a child he never knew existed. He felt a wave of emotions, shock, confusion, and a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: regret. His mind raced with questions. Whose baby was this? Could it be his? And if so, why hadn't she told him? A voice behind him broke through his spiraling thoughts. Beautiful, isn't it? Nathaniel turned to find an older woman, one of the charity organizers, smiling warmly at him. That photo was taken about 2 years ago, she explained. The mother in the picture came to us in a very difficult situation, but she's one of our success stories now. He struggled to keep his composure. Do you know her name? The woman nodded. Elise Bennett. She was such a kind soul, always putting her child first. It was inspiring to see her rebuild her life for her little one. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. Elise Bennett. She hadn't even kept his name after the divorce. The thought stung more than he cared to admit. Do you happen to know where she is now? He asked, trying to sound casual. The woman's expression turned cautious. I'm afraid I can't give out that kind of information, but I can tell you that she's doing well, and her child is thriving. Nathaniel nodded, though her words did little to ease the storm raging inside him. The rest of the gala passed in a blur. He made polite conversation, donated generously to the cause, and maintained the facade of the charming CEO. But his mind remained fixed on the photograph, on Elise, and the possibility that he might have a child out there, an entire part of his life that had been hidden from him. When he finally left the event, sliding into the back seat of his chauffeured car, Nathaniel's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He knew he couldn't let this go. He had to find her, to uncover the truth. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with business deals or profits. As the city lights blurred past the car window, Nathaniel made a silent vow. He wouldn't stop until he knew the full story. Whatever it took, he would find Elise and get the answers he needed. Nathaniel sat in his study that evening, the room dimly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. The photograph from the gala was on his desk. Its image burned into his memory. His mind raced with possibilities, but no answers presented themselves. Elise had been out of his life for years, her departure abrupt and absolute. She hadn't just walked away from their marriage. She'd vanished, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. He stared at the photo, at the baby nestled in her arms. The resemblance was undeniable. Those eyes, that curve of the mouth. He couldn't shake the thought that the child might be his. And if that were true, how had he not known? The possibility of fatherhood stirred something deep within him, a mix of hope, fear, and determination. Nathaniel reached for his phone and dialed the one person he knew could help, his private investigator, Simon Reed. Simon was a seasoned professional who had helped Nathaniel navigate countless personal and professional challenges over the years. If anyone could find Elise, it was him. "Reed," Nathaniel began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need you to locate someone for me. Elise Bennett. She was my wife, years ago." Simon's pause was barely perceptible. "I'll get on it right away. Do you have any leads?" Nathaniel hesitated, then described the photograph and the charity's involvement. Simon listened intently, jotting down notes. "Understood. I'll dig into it and get back to you as soon as I have something." Hanging up the call, Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Memories of Elise flooded his mind, the way she used to light up a room with her laughter, the quiet moments they'd shared in the early days of their relationship, and the way it had all fallen apart. Their marriage had started with so much promise. Elise had been his anchor, grounding him in a world where success often came at the expense of personal connections. But as his career soared, so did the demands on his time and energy. He'd miss dinners, anniversaries, and quiet evenings at home, all in the name of building an empire. Elise had tried to reach him, but he'd been too consumed by work to notice the cracks forming between them. By the time he realized what he was losing, it was too late. Now, years later, the photograph served as a painful reminder of what he had let slip through his fingers. But if there was even a chance that the child in the picture was his, he couldn't afford to dwell on the past. He had to act. The following days were a blur of anticipation and impatience. Nathaniel threw himself into work, hoping to distract himself from the weight, but his focus wavered. Meetings blurred together, and his assistant noticed his uncharacteristic distraction. "Everything all right, Mr. Carter?" she asked one afternoon after a particularly disjointed briefing. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. When Simon finally called back, Nathaniel answered on the first ring. "I've got something," Simon said. "Elise is living in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. She's been working part-time at a community center and raising a child. Her son." Nathaniel's heart raced. "Her son?" "Yes," Simon confirmed. "He's 5 years old." The timeline hit Nathaniel like a freight train. 5 years. That meant the child had been born shortly after their divorce. His hands tightened around the phone. "Did you confirm? Is he mine?" "I can't say for sure," Simon admitted. "But the math adds up. If you want to know for certain, you'll have to speak to her yourself." Nathaniel thanked Simon and ended the call, his mind racing. He had the information he needed, but now came the hard part, confronting Elise. Would she even talk to him? And if the child was his, how would she explain keeping it from him for so long? The following morning, Nathaniel stood outside the small house Simon had described. It was a modest home, the kind of place that spoke of simplicity and resilience. The garden was tidy, with a few blooming flowers adding a touch of color. He felt out of place in his tailored suit, his presence an intrusion on the quiet normalcy of her life. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. What if she refused to see him? What if the child wasn't his? The thought sent a pang of fear through him, but he pushed it aside. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to face Elise. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the doorbell. Moments later, the door opened, and there she was. Elise stood before him, her expression a mix of shock and guarded curiosity. She looked different from how he remembered. Her hair was shorter, her face framed by a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. But her eyes were the same, filled with a warmth that had once drawn him in. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice steady but tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here?" He struggled to find the words, his gaze flicking to the sound of small footsteps approaching from behind her. A boy appeared, his bright eyes and messy hair an echo of someone Nathaniel couldn't quite place. Himself. "Elise," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Elise hesitated at the door, her hand gripping the edge tightly as if it were the only thing grounding her. Her eyes darted between Nathaniel's face and the boy standing behind her, curiosity brimming in his bright eyes. Nathaniel's heart thudded in his chest, a mix of fear, anticipation, and longing swirling within him. "Nathaniel," she repeated, her voice steadying. "This is unexpected." He nodded, unsure of how to begin. The words he had rehearsed on the drive over vanished from his mind, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. "I saw something at the gala," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A photograph of you with a child." Elise's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes. She stepped outside, pulling the door slightly closed behind her. "So, that's why you're here." Nathaniel glanced past her at the boy who was now peeking around the doorframe with a mix of shyness and curiosity. His heart ached at the sight. "Is he mine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elise's shoulders tensed, her grip tightening on the door. She seemed to weigh her words carefully, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, Nathaniel, he's your son." The confirmation hit him like a thunderclap, the ground beneath him seeming to shift. His knees felt weak, and he gripped the railing of the small porch for support. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you let me be part of his life?" Elise's gaze softened, though her voice carried a note of defiance. "You were so focused on your empire, Nathaniel. When I left, I wasn't just walking away from the marriage. I was walking away from a life where I felt invisible. I didn't think you'd want to know. I didn't think you'd have time for us." "I deserve to know," Nathaniel said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. "I deserved the chance to be his father." "And what kind of father would you have been back then?" Elise countered, her tone sharp. "The kind who missed every school recital because of a board meeting? The kind who couldn't put his phone down long enough to have dinner with his family? I didn't want that for him. I didn't want him to feel like an afterthought." Her words stung, but Nathaniel couldn't deny their truth. He had been that man, the one who prioritized work over everything else, who let ambition eclipse the people who mattered most. But standing here now, seeing his son for the first time, he knew he couldn't let the past define him. "I've changed, Elise," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I'm not the man I was then. I know I can't erase the mistakes I've made, but I want to make things right. Please, let me be part of his life." Elise studied him, her expression unreadable. The boy behind her tugged at her hand, his small voice breaking the tension. "Mommy, who is he?" She knelt down, pulling the child close. "This is Nathaniel, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's someone very important." The boy's wide eyes turned to Nathaniel, curiosity shining in their depths. "Are you a friend?" Nathaniel crouched down, his heart swelling as he met his son's gaze. "I'd like to be," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Evan," the boy replied shyly. "Evan," Nathaniel repeated, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "That's a strong name." Evan beamed, his confidence growing. "Mommy says I'm strong like her." Nathaniel's chest tightened at the boy's innocent words. "She's right," he said, glancing up at Elise. "You're very lucky to have her." Elise's expression softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. She straightened, her hand resting protectively on Evan's shoulder. "This is a lot for him to process," she said. "And for me." "I understand," Nathaniel said, rising to his feet. "I don't want to overwhelm you, but I'm not going anywhere, Elise. I want to be part of his life, if you'll let me." She hesitated, her walls still firmly in place. "We'll see," she said finally. "But this doesn't mean I'm ready to forgive you, Nathaniel. You have a lot to prove." "I know," he said, his tone resolute. "And I will." Elise nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. "I'll call you," she said, her voice softening, "when we're ready." Nathaniel took a step back, his gaze lingering on Evan one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As he walked away, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He had a son, a chance to be the father he should have been all along. And while the road ahead was uncertain, he was determined to earn his place in Evan's life, no matter how long it took. Nathaniel couldn't shake the image of Evan's curious, innocent eyes as he drove back to his penthouse. The luxury of his surroundings, once a source of pride, now felt hollow. For years, He had poured himself into building an empire, believing it would bring him happiness. Yet here he was, staring at the distant city lights, realizing that the true wealth he craved had been within reach all along. Family. The revelation that he had a son filled him with equal parts joy and regret. Joy at the chance to be part of Evan's life, and regret for all the moments he had already missed. Evan's first steps, his first words, birthdays and quiet bedtime stories, all gone, like sand slipping through his fingers. But if there was one thing Nathaniel excelled at, it was tenacity. He had built an empire from nothing. Surely he could rebuild trust and create a place in Evan's life. The next morning, Nathaniel sat at his desk surrounded by photos and videos of the charity event. He had tasked his assistant, Grace, with finding any additional details about the photo that had started it all. She placed a folder on his desk, her expression professional yet curious. "This is everything I could find," Grace said. The photo was part of a local initiative featuring single parents. Elise was nominated by the shelter she's been working with. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "A shelter?" "Yes," Grace confirmed. "She's been volunteering there for years, even after Evan was born. She's become something of a cornerstone for the community. She didn't just survive, Nathaniel. She thrived." The admiration in Grace's tone wasn't lost on Nathaniel. Elise had managed to rebuild her life from the ground up, all while raising their son. It was a testament to her strength and determination, a strength he had failed to recognize during their marriage. He flipped through the photos in the folder, his chest tightening as he saw images of Elise and Evan at the shelter. In one, Elise was painting a mural on a wall, while Evan, covered in paint smudges, laughed beside her. The joy on their faces was palpable, a stark contrast to the loneliness he now felt in his sterile, opulent penthouse. Determined to take action, Nathaniel began devising a plan. He would start by learning more about the shelter and the work Elise was involved in. If he was going to prove himself, he needed to show that he understood her world, not just from the outside, but from within. The following day, Nathaniel visited the shelter. The building was modest, its walls adorned with colorful murals and bulletin boards showcasing community events. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a haven for families seeking refuge and support. Nathaniel approached the front desk, his tailored suit making him stand out among the casually dressed staff and volunteers. "Good morning," he said, offering a polite smile. "I'm Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'd like to speak with someone about volunteering." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Volunteering?" she repeated, glancing at his expensive watch and polished shoes. "Yes," Nathaniel said firmly. "I want to contribute, not just financially, but with my time." The receptionist studied him for a moment before nodding. "Talk to Mrs. Jenkins. She's the volunteer coordinator." Mrs. Jenkins was a sprightly older woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. She listened as Nathaniel explained his interest, her expression unreadable. "We don't get many billionaire CEOs walking in here offering to volunteer," she said dryly. "What's your angle?" "No angle," Nathaniel replied. "I just want to help." Mrs. Jenkins narrowed her eyes but eventually nodded. "All right, but you start at the bottom like everyone else. No special treatment." Nathaniel smiled. Fair enough. His first day at the shelter was humbling. He cleaned floors, organized donations, and served meals alongside other volunteers. It was hard work, and by the end of the day his muscles ached in ways he hadn't experienced in years. But as he watched families share meals and children laugh despite their struggles, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't long before word of Nathaniel's involvement reached Elise. She arrived at the shelter one afternoon to find him in the children's playroom, assembling a bookshelf with a group of volunteers. Evan sat nearby, watching intently as Nathaniel used a screwdriver with the precision of someone determined to prove himself. Elise folded her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I didn't expect to see you here." Nathaniel looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "I wanted to understand your world," he said simply, "and I wanted to be closer to Evan." Elise's expression softened, though she maintained a cautious distance. "This isn't going to be easy, Nathaniel. You can't just walk in and expect everything to fall into place." "I know," he said, setting down the screwdriver, "but I'm willing to put in the work. For you. For Evan." Their conversation was interrupted by Evan, who ran up to Nathaniel with a book in hand. "Can you read this to me?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Nathaniel knelt down, taking the book from Evan. "Of course," he said, his voice filled with warmth. As Nathaniel read aloud, Elise watched from the sidelines, her emotions a whirlwind of hope, doubt, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: trust. Nathaniel's presence was still a disruption to the life she had built, but she couldn't deny the effort he was making. For the first time, she began to wonder if reconciliation, however distant it seemed, might be possible. Nathaniel continued to volunteer at the shelter, his dedication unwavering. Every day he showed up early, dressed in casual clothes that matched the humble atmosphere of the space. He worked tirelessly, not just to impress Elise, but to genuinely contribute to the community that had supported her and Evan when he hadn't been there. He learned the names of the families staying at the shelter, listened to their stories, and even started using his resources to quietly improve the facility. New mattresses replaced worn-out ones, a broken heating system was repaired, and a shipment of school supplies arrived for the children. Nathaniel insisted on anonymity for his contributions, understanding that this wasn't about grand gestures. It was about rebuilding trust and proving his sincerity through consistent action. For Elise, watching Nathaniel immerse himself in this world was disorienting. The man she had once known, the ruthless business-first billionaire, seemed to have been replaced by someone more grounded, more compassionate. She couldn't ignore the changes, but her heart remained guarded. She had built a life for herself and Evan without Nathaniel, and the thought of letting him back in terrified her. One afternoon, Elise arrived at the shelter to find Nathaniel leading a group of children in a craft activity. The sight of him sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colorful construction paper and giggling kids, caught her off guard. Evan sat beside him, diligently gluing pieces of paper together to create what looked like a robot. "Mommy, look!" Evan exclaimed, holding up his creation. "Mr. Nathan helped me make this." Elise forced a smile, her heart aching at the casual way Evan referred to Nathaniel as Mr. Nathan. It was a reminder of how much her son had missed out on. A father's presence, a father's love. "That's amazing, sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to examine the robot. "You did a great job." Nathaniel looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "Evan's got quite the imagination," he said, his tone soft. Elise nodded, standing up and crossing her arms. "He gets that from me." Nathaniel smiled faintly, sensing the tension in her stance. "Elise, can we talk?" She hesitated, glancing at Evan, who was now engrossed in adding stickers to his robot. "All right," she said, motioning for Nathaniel to follow her into a quieter corner of the room. Once they were alone, Nathaniel spoke. "I know I can't undo the past. I can't change the fact that I wasn't there for you and Evan when you needed me most. But I want to be here now. I want to be the father Evan deserves and the partner I should have been for you." Elise's arms tightened across her chest. "You think it's that simple? That showing up now can make up for years of absence?" "No," Nathaniel admitted, his voice steady. "I know it's not simple, but I'm willing to work for it. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I've changed." Elise shook her head, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "You don't understand, Nathaniel. It's not just about you. It's about me, about Evan. I had to rebuild everything from the ground up after you walked away. I had to be strong for our son while dealing with the heartbreak of losing you." Her voice cracked and she looked away, blinking back tears. Nathaniel's chest tightened at the sight of her pain he had caused. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so focused on my career, on chasing success, that I lost sight of what really mattered. But I see it now, Elise. I see you, and I see Evan, and I want to do better. I want to be better." Elise turned back to him, her expression a mix of anger, sadness, and something softer, something like hope. "Words are easy, Nathaniel. Prove it." "I will," he promised. "Not just for you, but for Evan. He deserves to know his father, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn that privilege." Their conversation ended there, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. As they returned to the main room, Elise couldn't help but notice the way Nathaniel knelt beside Evan, his attention fully on their son. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a glimpse of the father Nathaniel could become. That evening, as Elise tucked Evan into bed, he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, do you think Mr. Nathan will come back tomorrow?" Elise hesitated, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. "I think he will, sweetheart," she said finally, brushing a hand through his hair. I think he will. And as Evan drifted off to sleep, Elise sat by his bedside, her mind racing. She wasn't ready to forgive Nathaniel completely. Not yet. But for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that he could change. That maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel became a steady presence in Elise and Evan's lives. He showed up at the shelter every morning, helping with whatever was needed, from organizing supplies to mentoring residents looking for employment opportunities. It wasn't glamorous work, but Nathaniel approached it with genuine dedication. Slowly but surely, he began to win over the people around him, including Elise. For Elise, it was a confusing time. She couldn't ignore the changes in Nathaniel, the way he seemed more present, more attuned to the needs of those around him. It was a stark contrast to the man she had married, whose focus had always been on work and status. But the scars of their past still lingered, and she struggled to reconcile her growing feelings with the pain he had caused. One afternoon, Elise found herself sitting with Linda, one of the shelter's longtime volunteers, during a rare moment of quiet. He's been coming here every day, Linda observed, nodding toward Nathaniel, who was outside helping fix a broken fence. Elise sighed, sipping her tea. I know. And I don't know, Elise admitted. It's like he's a different person now, but I can't shake the memories of who he was back then. I don't know if I can trust him. Linda gave her a sympathetic smile. People can change, Elise. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what really matters. But only you can decide if you're willing to let him back in. Elise nodded, her thoughts swirling. She knew Linda was right, but the decision felt monumental, like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if the leap would lead to a soft landing or another painful fall. Later that evening, as Elise was cleaning up in the kitchen, Nathaniel approached her, his expression hesitant. Elise, he began, his voice soft. Can we talk? She set down the dish she was holding, crossing her arms as she turned to face him. What is it? I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that happened, he said. I know I hurt you, and I know it's going to take time to rebuild the trust I broke, but I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm committed to being here for you and Evan, no matter what it takes. Elise studied him, her defenses still firmly in place. Why now, Nathaniel? Why the sudden change? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. Because losing you was the biggest mistake of my life, and seeing that photograph at the gala, it was like a wake-up call. It reminded me of what I'd given up, of what I could have had if I'd been brave enough to put you and Evan first. Her gaze softened slightly, though her skepticism remained. Words are easy, Nathaniel. It's your actions that matter. I know, he said earnestly, and I hope you'll let me prove myself, not just to you, but to Evan. He deserves to have his father in his life. The mention of Evan tugged at Elise's heart. She had seen the way her son lit up around Nathaniel, how quickly he had bonded with the man he didn't even realize was his father. And while she still struggled with her own feelings, she couldn't deny that Evan deserved the chance to know his dad. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said finally, her voice firm but not unkind. But I'm willing to give you the opportunity to prove yourself, for Evan's sake. Nathaniel nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. Thank you, Elise. I promise, I won't let you down. As the days turned into weeks, Nathaniel continued to show up, not just physically, but emotionally. He spent hours with Evan, playing games, reading stories, and listening to the endless stream of questions only a curious 5-year-old could ask. He also worked closely with Elise at the shelter, respecting her leadership and offering support without overstepping. One evening, as they were closing up for the day, Elise found herself watching Nathaniel from across the room. He was laughing with Evan, his face lit up in a way she hadn't seen in years. It was a small moment, but it stirred something deep within her, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. For the first time in a long time, Elise allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future where forgiveness and love could coexist with the pain of the past. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew she was ready to take the first step. As Nathaniel worked tirelessly to mend the rift between him and Elise, one unexpected ally began to emerge. Evan, the young boy, with his boundless curiosity and innocent heart, became a bridge between his parents, pulling them closer in ways neither could have anticipated. Evan had taken to Nathaniel quickly, captivated by his stories of adventures and the way he always seemed to make time for him. Whether it was building Lego towers, kicking a soccer ball in the park, or answering endless why questions, Nathaniel poured his energy into their moments together. For a boy who had grown up without a father, this new presence was a thrilling novelty. One evening, as Elise was tidying up in the living room, she overheard a conversation between Nathaniel and Evan. The two were sitting on the floor, surrounded by toy cars and action figures. "Dad," Evan said, his small voice tentative but full of wonder, "why did you and Mom not live together before?" The word "dad" hit Elise like a jolt. Nathaniel froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard, before his expression softened. "Well," Nathaniel began, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. I made a mistake, Evan, a big one, but I'm trying to fix it now." Evan tilted his head, considering this. "Did Mom forgive you?" Nathaniel glanced toward the kitchen as if sensing Elise's presence. "She's still deciding, but I hope she will, because I care about both of you very much." Evan seemed satisfied with this answer, returning his attention to the toy car in his hands. Elise, however, was left reeling, hearing Nathaniel refer to himself as Evan's father, and Evan accept it so naturally, brought a wave of emotions she wasn't prepared for. It was a bittersweet reminder of everything they had lost, but also of what they could potentially rebuild. The next day, Evan's daycare hosted a parent-child event, and Elise invited Nathaniel to join them. She wasn't sure why she extended the invitation. Perhaps it was the look on Evan's face when he asked if Dad could come too. Whatever the reason, Nathaniel agreed without hesitation. The event was a simple affair, filled with crafts, snacks, and a mini talent show where the children proudly showcased their abilities. Evan insisted on participating in the show, dragging both his parents to the front row to watch. "I'm going to sing a song," Evan declared, his voice ringing out with excitement. Elise and Nathaniel exchanged a look, both suppressing a laugh. "We can't wait to hear it," Nathaniel said, his tone full of encouragement. Evan's performance was far from polished. He forgot half the lyrics and sang off-key, but it didn't matter. As he belted out the chorus with gusto, Elise felt a lump form in her throat. Glancing at Nathaniel, she saw the same emotion mirrored in his eyes. For that brief moment, they weren't a fractured family. They were just parents, united in their love for their son. After the event, as they walked back to Elise's car, Evan reached up to take both of their hands. "That was fun," he said, beaming. "Can we do stuff like this more?" Elise hesitated, unsure how to respond. But Nathaniel, ever quick on his feet, smiled down at his son. "Of course, buddy. We'll do lots of things together." That night, as Elise tucked Evan into bed, he looked up at her with wide, earnest eyes. "Mom, do you like Dad?" The question caught her off guard, and she stumbled over her words. I think he's trying really hard, Evan, and I think he loves you very much." Evan nodded, his small face thoughtful. "I think he loves you too." Elise left the room feeling a mix of emotions: gratitude for Evan's innocence, admiration for Nathaniel's efforts, and a nagging fear of letting herself hope for too much. But as she lay in bed that night, the memory of Evan holding their hands stayed with her, a flicker of light in the darkness of her doubts. Over the next few weeks, Evan's role as an unwitting mediator became even more apparent. He would insist on family outings, suggest games that required all three of them to participate, and ask questions that forced Elise and Nathaniel to communicate in ways they hadn't in years. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to lower. One rainy afternoon, as they played a board game in the living room, Elise caught herself laughing at something Nathaniel said. It was a rare, unguarded moment, and when their eyes met, she saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Evan, oblivious to the tension and history between them, clapped his hands. "See? We're a team." Elise smiled at her son, her heart swelling with love. For all the pain and uncertainty, there was something undeniably powerful about the way Evan brought them together, and while she wasn't ready to fully trust Nathaniel yet, she couldn't deny that their son had created a bond that might just be strong enough to hold them all together. As weeks turned into months, the tentative equilibrium in Elise and Nathaniel's lives began to shift. Though she had been steadfast in her resolve to protect herself and Evan, Elise couldn't ignore the changes she saw in Nathaniel. He was no longer the man who had walked away years ago. His dedication to Evan, his consistent efforts to bridge the gap, and his humility in facing his past mistakes were undeniable. But trust, Elise knew, was fragile, easily broken and painstakingly rebuilt. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nathaniel knocked on the door of Elise's modest home. He carried a small box, wrapped neatly with a bow. When Elise answered, she raised an eyebrow at the unexpected gift. "What's this?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. "It's not what you think," Nathaniel said quickly, sensing her apprehension. "It's for Evan, something small but meaningful." Elise hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Evan, hearing his father's voice, came bounding down the hallway. His eyes lit up when he saw the box. "What is it, Dad?" Evan asked eagerly. Nathaniel knelt to his son's level and handed him the gift. "Open it and find out." Evan tore through the wrapping paper with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Inside was a photo album, filled with pictures that Nathaniel had painstakingly compiled over the past few months. It included snapshots from their recent outings, candid moments of Evan playing, and even a few older photos Nathaniel had found from when he and Elise were together. Evan's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "Wow, this is so cool. Look, Mom, it's us." Elise glanced over Evan's shoulder, her heart softening at the sight of the memories captured within. There was a picture of Evan with a wide grin, his face smudged with ice cream, and another of Nathaniel hoisting him onto his shoulders at the park. There were even a few pictures of Elise herself, caught in unguarded moments of laughter. "It's a way for us to remember the good times," Nathaniel explained, his voice quiet but sincere, "and to remind Evan, and ourselves, that no matter what, we're a family." Elise swallowed hard, emotions welling up inside her. She had spent so long guarding her heart, shielding herself from the pain of their past, that she hadn't allowed herself to fully see the man Nathaniel was becoming. This gesture, simple yet profound, was a reflection of his effort to mend what had been broken. "Thank you," Elise said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "This means a lot." Nathaniel nodded, his expression earnest. "I just want to do right by both of you." As the evening wore on, they sat together in the living room, flipping through the album while Evan excitedly recounted the stories behind each photo. For a few fleeting hours, it felt almost normal, like a family rediscovering its rhythm. Later that night, after Evan had gone to bed, Nathaniel lingered in the doorway, reluctant to leave. "Elise," he began, his tone tentative, "I know I've said this before, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. And I'm not just saying that. I'm trying to show you." "I see that," Elise admitted, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "But it's not just about saying or even showing, Nathaniel. It's about consistency. It's about proving that you're here to stay." "I am," he said firmly, his gaze steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Elise. Not again." Her heart wavered, caught between the fear of being hurt again and the undeniable hope that maybe, just maybe, Nathaniel meant what he said. She had spent years building a life for herself and Evan, piecing together a sense of stability after the turmoil of their separation. Letting Nathaniel back in felt like a risk, but it was a risk she was beginning to consider taking. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said finally, her voice soft but guarded. "Good night, Elise," he replied, stepping outside. As the door closed behind him, Elise leaned against it, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and possibility. In the days that followed, Nathaniel's consistency became impossible to ignore. He showed up to Evan's school events, volunteered at community fundraisers, and even offered to help Elise with her work at the local clinic. Every action, every gesture was a testament to his sincerity, and slowly, Elise's guarded heart began to waver. One Saturday afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, Elise stumbled upon a box of mementos from their marriage. Inside were love letters, ticket stubs from their first dates, and photos from their honeymoon. As she sifted through the memories, she felt a pang of nostalgia, a bittersweet reminder of what they had once shared. Among the items was a letter Nathaniel had written to her on their first wedding anniversary. In it, he had poured out his hopes for their future, his dreams of building a life together filled with love and laughter. Reading it now, Elise couldn't help but wonder if those dreams were still within reach. That evening, she found herself sitting in the living room, holding the letter as Evan played nearby. When Nathaniel arrived to pick Evan up for an outing, he noticed the letter in her hand. "I didn't think you still had that," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. Elise looked up, her expression unreadable. I kept it because it reminded me of what we used to have, and what we lost. Nathaniel sat beside her, his gaze filled with regret. I know I can't change the past, Elise, but I'd give anything for the chance to build something new with you and Evan. She studied him for a long moment, her heart torn between caution and hope. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but vulnerable. I'm not ready to make any promises, Nathaniel, but I'm willing to try, for Evan's sake, and for ours. Nathaniel's face lit up with gratitude and determination. That's all I could ever ask for. As Evan bounded over to join them, his laughter filling the room, Elise felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years, the hope of a new beginning. With Elise's tentative agreement to try, a new chapter began to unfold in their lives. It wasn't an easy transition. Trust, once shattered, takes time to rebuild. But for the first time in years, there was a shared understanding, a sense of mutual effort to create something better for themselves and for Evan. Nathaniel, true to his word, embraced every opportunity to prove his sincerity. He showed up not just for the big moments, but for the small, everyday ones. The school drop-offs, the family dinners, the quiet evenings where he helped Evan with his homework. These were the moments that had once been missing from their lives, and Nathaniel was determined not to let them slip away again. For Elise, it was a journey of cautious optimism. She found herself observing Nathaniel with a mix of skepticism and admiration. He was no longer the distant, work-obsessed man she had divorced. This version of Nathaniel was present, attentive, and willing to admit when he didn't have all the answers. And while her walls remained partially intact, they began to crumble ever so slightly with each act of kindness, each unspoken gesture of care. One afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled in the crisp air, Nathaniel invited Elise and Evan to spend the day at his estate, a sprawling property that Evan had only ever heard about in stories. Initially hesitant, Elise agreed, wanting Evan to experience a part of his father's life that had previously felt inaccessible. When they arrived, Evan's eyes widened in wonder at the sight of the grand house and expansive gardens. Nathaniel, sensing Elise's discomfort, kept things simple. Instead of a lavish tour, he led them to a cozy corner of the garden where he had set up a picnic. The gesture was understated but meaningful, a reflection of his effort to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. As they sat together, enjoying sandwiches and warm cider, Evan ran around the garden, his laughter echoing through the air. Elise watched him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and longing. Nathaniel, seated beside her, followed her gaze. He's incredible, Nathaniel said softly, his voice filled with awe. You've done an amazing job raising him, Elise. She turned to him, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering hurt. I didn't have a choice. You weren't there. Nathaniel's face fell, the weight of her words cutting deep. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I want to make up for the time I lost. Elise looked away, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this time would be different. But the wounds of their past were still fresh, and forgiveness didn't come easily. Later, as they walked through the estate, Evan ran ahead, exploring every corner with boundless energy. Nathaniel and Elise followed at a slower pace, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. This place, it's beautiful, Elise said finally, breaking the quiet. But it feels lonely. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze distant. It was, for a long time. I thought I needed all of this to be happy, but it never filled the emptiness inside me, not until I saw you and Evan again. His confession caught Elise off guard. She had always seen Nathaniel as a man who thrived on success and ambition, someone who had chosen his career over their family. Hearing him acknowledge his loneliness was both surprising and deeply humanizing. I don't know if I can forget everything that happened, Elise said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. But I'm trying to move forward, for Evan's sake, and maybe for mine too. Nathaniel stopped walking, turning to face her. That's all I want, Elise. A chance to show you that I've changed, to be the man you and Evan deserve. Her heart wavered, caught between the fear of being hurt again and the hope of something better. We'll see, she said finally, her tone cautious but not dismissive. As the day came to an end and they prepared to leave, Evan ran up to them clutching a handful of wildflowers he had picked from the garden. For you, Mom, he said, presenting the bouquet with a wide grin. Elise knelt down, accepting the flowers with a smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're beautiful." Nathaniel watched the exchange, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but moments like these made every effort worthwhile. That night, as Elise tucked Evan into bed, he looked up at her with innocent curiosity. "Mom, do you think Dad will stay with us forever?" Elise's heart ached at the question. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know, Evan, but I think he's trying very hard to be here for us." Evan nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep. "I like it when he's here." Elise kissed his forehead, her heart heavy with both hope and uncertainty. As she left his room, she found herself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, they could find their way back to being a family. For now, all she could do was take it one step at a time. In the weeks that followed their visit to Nathaniel's estate, a fragile but undeniable bond began to form between the three of them. Elise still carried her doubts, but Nathaniel's persistence and unwavering effort started to chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. He wasn't just showing up physically, he was present in every sense of the word, determined to make up for the time he had lost. Nathaniel's transformation didn't go unnoticed by Evan either. The young boy, who had once been shy and uncertain around his father, now sought his company with unguarded enthusiasm. From soccer games in the park to impromptu science experiments in the kitchen, the two had developed a connection that left Elise both relieved and cautiously hopeful. One crisp winter morning, as snow blanketed the city, Nathaniel invited Elise and Evan to join him for a family outing. He had planned a day of ice skating followed by hot chocolate at a nearby cafe. A simple but thoughtful gesture that he hoped would create lasting memories. Elise hesitated at first, her protective instincts warning her against letting her guard down too quickly. But when she saw the excitement in Evan's eyes, she couldn't bring herself to say no. At the ice rink, Nathaniel proved to be surprisingly adept on skates, gliding effortlessly across the ice while Evan clung to him for balance. Elise watched from the sidelines at first, her heart warming at the sight of them laughing and stumbling together. When Nathaniel extended a hand to her, a playful challenge in his eyes, she hesitated for only a moment before accepting. The three of them moved across the ice, their laughter echoing in the cold air. It wasn't perfect. Evan fell more times than he stayed upright, and Elise's nerves occasionally got the better of her. But it was real. For the first time in years, it felt like they were a family again. As the sun set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, they made their way to the cafe. Over steaming mugs of hot chocolate, they shared stories and jokes, the conversation flowing with an ease that had once seemed impossible. "Mom, did you see how fast Dad was going?" Evan asked, his face flushed with excitement. "I did," Elise replied with a smile, "but I also saw how many times he nearly fell." Nathaniel chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Guilty as charged, but I think Evan was the real star out there." Evan beamed, his chest puffing out with pride. "Next time I'll be even better." Elise's gaze softened as she watched the exchange. There was a warmth, a lightness to Nathaniel now that she hadn't seen during their marriage. It was as though he had finally shed the weight of his ambition, allowing himself to focus on what truly mattered. Later that evening, back at Elise's modest apartment, Nathaniel lingered after tucking Evan into bed. The two of them stood in the living room, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space between them. "Thank you for today," Elise said, her voice sincere. "It meant a lot to Evan, and to me." Nathaniel smiled, his hands in his pockets. "It meant a lot to me too. I've missed so much, Elise. I don't want to miss any more." Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this wasn't just a temporary effort, but a genuine commitment to their family. "You've come a long way, Nathaniel," she admitted. "But trust isn't something that happens overnight. It's something you have to earn, step by step." "I know," he said softly, "and I'm willing to keep earning it for as long as it takes." For the first time, Elise allowed herself to entertain the possibility of a future together. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees, but as she looked into Nathaniel's eyes, she saw a man who was no longer defined by his past mistakes but by his determination to be better. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said, her tone warm but firm. "Good night, Elise," he replied, his smile genuine. As he left, Elise closed the door behind him, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. There was still work to be done, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope that their fractured family could be whole again. And as she stood there in the quiet of her home, she realized that perhaps the hardest part of healing wasn't learning to forgive others, it was learning to forgive herself for believing it might not be possible.